at Neve Yerushalayim. We're doing the Mystical Hebrew Alphabet series. And where we left off last time was masculine means to give over an effect outside of yourself. And feminine means to take something, work on it, and raise it to a higher level. And we were discussing why masculine words typically in Hebrew grammar lack the ability to have that hey, that integration of the physical and the spiritual together. And feminine words typically end in the hey, which represents integrating the physical and the spiritual together. And as a step-by-step process of answering that question, we're redefining on a broader level masculine and feminine, which is more than just sexual differentiation and gender, the way we were taught growing up. Masculine and feminine in Torah applies to everything because Torah has no neutral gender. And therefore we have the side of giving, which is chesed, that's a masculine interaction, and the rules and limitations which enable you to take something to a higher level, that is a feminine interaction. Which leads us to insights in Judaism that will make more sense once we have these two definitions. And one is, why does God use gendered names in the Torah if God has no gender? Now, let's start with the premise, God has no gender. How do we know God has? Maybe God is a, when I teach on college campuses, one of the most common questions I'm asked is, why, Rabbi, do you keep calling God a he? Maybe God's a she. It's a very common question. And the answer obviously is God's not a he or a she. God's an is. God just is. God has no gender. Now, what's the logic behind understanding that God has no gender? Let's say you're new at learning Torah. Still instinctively, it makes sense God has no gender. Why? The answer is that God is infinitely one. Infinite oneness means no front, no back, no right, no left, no up, no down, right? Just one. So therefore, since gender essentially is a division, male, female, it can't describe God's essence, which is not divisible. God's just infinitely one, right? So if God's infinitely one, don't say there's a male and a female, that's a division. Make sense? So therefore, if God wants a creation to have masculine and feminine, he can will that duality, that differentiation into existence. But all differentiations come from God's will. They're not God's essence, because God's essence is totally unified. Okay, make sense? So therefore, God has no gender. God just is, right? As a matter of fact, according to Judaism, we did this when we did the letter Aleph, God is the only thing that really is, meaning God is the only thing whose existence is not dependent on anything else for its existence. God just is. There's no cause for God, right? Everything else isn't, meaning everything else isn't God. Everything else is what God wants. So if God wants there to be a world of differentiation, so God can create a world of differentiation, and therefore God takes that infinite oneness and then causes a reality to exist which appears differentiated into masculine and feminine. That's something God's causing. Okay? So therefore, if God wants her to be masculine and feminine, then God's not a he or a she. That's something God's willing into existence. So let's go back to the question. Why do we always call God a he? He wants you to learn Torah. He wants you to keep mitzvahs. Really, is wants you to learn Torah and is wants you to keep mitzvahs. But that's really awkward to say. It doesn't sound so... It's not a nice way to talk about God. So why do we use he as opposed to she? And the answer is like this. What do God's names really describe? In other words, God has no gender, but in the Torah he uses names, and therefore those names can carry gender. But what do God's names describe? Now, I mentioned this in previous classes that God is really not describable. Now, your Hebrew name can describe something having to do with your soul, but there's no way to describe God. So when God uses names, it's not possible that God's describing this infinite oneness, infinite perfection, beyond time, matter, space, and energy, beyond the universe, beyond reality, because that's beyond any understanding or beyond any label, beyond any description. Meaning, since God is not labelable, and a name is a label, so God's names cannot describe God. That's for sure. That's one of the primary axioms of Judaism. So if God's names really don't describe God, what in the world is he doing labeling himself with names? The answer is God's names describe what this person's brain can perceive in terms of different types of interactions. In other words, God's names do not label God. That's not possible. God's names label different ways God interacts with creation. So God says, when you see me interacting with your world by methodology X, call me name X. When you see me interacting with creation by methodology Y, call me name Y. And therefore, that helps us track interactions which enable us to work backwards and try to connect to God better. Okay? Now, with that understanding, does it make sense why most of God's names are going to be masculine? 90-some% of God's names, he's going to label himself with a masculine. Why does it make total sense? Right, because from our brain's perspective, we perceive God giving over and affecting us. Giving over and affecting us with our health, our wealth, our atoms, our molecules, our electrons, our intelligence. All these things are God giving over and affecting. So God says, of course I'm going to use masculine labels. Because they don't describe me. I'm not a he. I was going to say God forbid, but I guess it means me forbid. Me forbid. I have no gender. I'm an is. But since your brain's going to track most of those interactions as God giving over and affecting us, so he's going to use masculine labels. And that's why there's a very famous feminine name where we would refer to God as a she. And that name is the Shekinah. Have you ever heard the term Shekinah used before? The Shekinah is often translated as God's divine presence. Or in the 40 years in the desert, it was God's clouds of glory that surrounded us. Or when you went to the temple, when the temple was standing in Jerusalem thousands of years ago, it was God's divine presence, which on some level you could sense. So that presence, that closeness, you see, it seems that the Shekinah is a label that's feminine that God uses to describe a certain closeness with our world a certain closeness that God has with our world that we can perceive. Does that make sense? Well, when we left Egypt and we were surrounded by God's protective clouds, that was a label for the Shekinah. And the Shekinah has that hey ending, so it's a feminine word. So why would God use a feminine label there? See, when God typically uses masculine names, what's he implying? Since he gives over and affects us with our existence or whatever it is that's flowing down from the spiritual realm, so that means we, metaphorically, are feminine relative to God. Why? Because we're going to take all the things he gives us, we're going to work on ourselves and make ourselves better people. Or we're going to take everything he gives us, work on ourselves and make the world a better place. So therefore, we, the Jewish people, would be feminine to those typical masculine names of God. Does that make sense? But when God labels himself with a feminine name, what's he implying? What's God implying? God's implying that we Jews are masculine relative to that relationship with God. So you see, the Jewish people can change gender depending on what interaction we're tracking. So relative to the Shekinah, which is a feminine label, we must be masculine. So if we Jews are masculine relative to that label, it must mean from our brain's perspective, because remember, this does not describe God, it describes an interaction. From our brain's perspective, it must be that we can give over and affect that interaction. Because God's using a feminine name, which means we're masculine, we're affecting it. We're giving over to it. Does that make sense? Are you with me? Step by step, right? You with me, ladies? Okay. So now, how do we affect that name? Well, it's this feminine name that we Jews can actually pull down closer into our world if we learn Torah and do mitzvahs properly. That creates a positive spiritual voltage, which brings more godliness into our world. And since this name is feminine, meaning it's responding to how we give over, if we don't learn Torah and do mitzvahs properly, then that negativity we're causing through poor free will choices actually pushes godliness out of this world. So really the closeness of God in terms of interacting with us with this feminine name, this divine presence, this Shekinah, is really ultimately being determined by your and my free will decision making. Torah and mitzvahs bring God closer, and lying, cheating, and stealing pushes God away. So what Hashem says is, since you're giving over and affecting the closeness of this relationship to you, I'm going to call you masculine, I'm going to call myself feminine. Whereas the other names of God, we're not bringing godliness down and pushing godliness out. It's just a different type of interaction. God's affecting us on some level. Are you with me? Any questions on this so far? So the obvious question everyone asks at this point is, come on, what do you mean you're going to bring godliness down and push godliness out? You can't bring godliness down and push godliness out. God's infinitely everywhere. God's already here. What do you mean bring godliness down? Kind of strange label is that? And yet that's the implication of us being masculine to the Shekinah. Learn Torah, do mitzvahs, bring godliness down. Lie, cheat, and steal, push godliness out. And your brain's going, hey, that makes no sense whatsoever. There's nowhere for God to go. God's infinitely everywhere. Hear the problem? So we actually answered this problem when we did a different letter of the alphabet a few weeks back. Now, not to scare me, but could you just raise your hand if you were here from when we did Aleph? Anyone here from when we did Aleph? Just one of you? Were any of you here from when we did Beit? How about Gimel? Dalet? Okay, so for those one of you who've been here since we did Aleph, can you think back to Aleph, Beit, Gimel, Dalet, maybe even Hey, where we previously learned how you can bring godliness down or push godliness out? When we did the letter Beit 4 weeks ago or something like that, when we did the letter Beit, we asked the question, why was the Beit facing away from the Aleph? The Beit is letter of connection relationship. So really, if Aleph represents God's oneness, the Beit should be facing the Aleph, right? We had this whole big class on why the Beit has its back to the Aleph. Anyway, we're not going to do that again. But what we said was that when God gave us free will and created us in His image, He allowed our free will to affect how the spiritual realm runs. When you learn Torah and do mitzvahs, you create positive voltage, which positively impacts on the spiritual realm, right? When you lie, cheat, and steal, you create negative voltage, which negatively impacts on the spiritual realm. And we said that the positive voltage brings godliness into this world, and not using Torah and mitzvahs properly and being a damager pushes godliness out of this world. Now, when we did that with the letter Beit about a month ago, nobody stopped and asked me, how can you bring godliness in this world? How can you push godliness out of this world? God's already here. God's everywhere. There's no way to bring God down and push God out. Which I'm glad you didn't ask me, because I really wanted to get to Hey to answer it. Now that we're at Hey, we can understand it. Because let's go back and talk about using your Torah and mitzvahs properly to bring a closeness to God, or using damage to push God out. So let's relook at the first 6 days of creation. In the first 6 days of creation, pre-day one of creation, all there is the infinite oneness, infinite perfection of God. But to give you free will, so that maybe God exists, maybe He doesn't, He spends the first 6 days of creation creating layer upon layer upon layer upon layer upon layer of a mask of nature, of physics, chemistry, biology, which gets more and more ordered, more and more structured, more and more complex. So by the time day 6 rolls around, human beings are put on the other side of day 6 and told the meaning of life is connection back to God. But now that mask of physics, chemistry, and biology is so thick, you can go through life an atheist. Right? If human beings are on the other side of the mask, and all you can see, smell, touch, and taste, and feel is the physical world, you can't see, smell, touch, and taste spirituality, you could theoretically say there is no God. That's one mechanism God used during the first 6 days of creation to give you free will. Maybe He's in the room right now, maybe He's not, correct? Remember this? Does that make sense to those of you who weren't here? Any way I can help you with it? Is there any way you could be? Pre-day one of creation, there's just God. There's no before or after. God just is, right? So God's using the creation process. Let there be light, let there be land, let there be fish and birds, let there be stars, whatever it is. Each one's creating another layer of a mask of nature, physics, chemistry, biology, which is getting more and more ordered, more and more structured, more and more complex to hide God. So by the time human beings are created on the other side of day 6, you could theoretically go through life not knowing whether God's in the room right now or not.
My understanding was that God is in all of those things, in all of those layers of physical creation.
God's the source of them. But when you look at a blue pen, do you see godliness?
Not godliness, but
you see no, you see Bic. Bic makes blue pens. So if a pen radiated godly spirituality, you'd look at pens and become more religious. God says, I don't want pens to make you more religious. I want you to make yourself more religious. Make sense? So that nature, that's why you can have physicists and chemists and biologists who are secular or atheists. So God says, yeah, I want to give you free will. I want you to say, listen, God, I know you're up there. The mask of physics, chemistry, biology doesn't fool me. I know it's coming from you. I know everything's coming from you. I want a relationship. That's what you're supposed to do. But you could look at the mask of nature and say, well, if you can't see it, smell, touch, or taste, it doesn't exist, and therefore there is no God. You follow? So that's a mechanism, God hiding is a mechanism to give you free will. Now, watch very carefully, okay? Let's say God hides behind the first 6 days of creation, all those 10 layers of the mask to give you free will. Maybe he's in the room right now, maybe he's not. Now, watch this. When he wires your free will into his spiritual mechanism of how the world runs, and you learn Torah and do mitzvahs, right? You're thinking, well, it's supposed to bring godliness into my world. And when I lie, cheat, and steal, it's supposed to push godliness out of my world. But I'm not bringing godliness into my world and pushing godliness out of my world because God's already infinitely everywhere. But really, your free will is tied into the thickness of the mask God hides behind. I'm pausing for dramatic impact. Are you following this? In other words, what if God wired your decision-making into the mask, not into him? He's not affectable. But if he wires your decision-making into the mask, when you learn Torah and do mitzvahs and you create a positive voltage, what you're really doing is, through your free will decision-making, you're making that mask thinner. But look what it looks like to your brain. If the mask becomes thinner, it looks like you're bringing godliness into this world. And if you lie, cheat, and steal, your free will decision-making is wired into the thickness of the mask. So when you made the mask thicker, it looks to your brain like you pushed godliness out of this world. God didn't go anywhere. It's just the closeness is the thinning of the mask, and the distance is the thickening of the mask. So therefore, when God uses a feminine name, he's saying, my closeness now is in your free will hands. Be careful how you use your free will. If you use it properly, then you'll thin the mask and it'll feel like you're bringing me down into your midst. I was really always there, but you'll feel the closest you didn't feel before. Does that make sense? Lie, cheat, and steal, not use Torah mitzvahs properly, and you thicken my mask. It's as if you pushed me back into the spiritual realm, even though I didn't go anywhere, but you're going to feel that distance because you just thicken the mask between us. And that's why the Shekinah is feminine, and we're giving over and affecting that closest versus that distance. Okay, so now we have, even though God has no gender, God's names are gendered. Because God's, and this is when I get asked from college campuses, why do you keep calling God a he? And I say, well, God's not a he, God's an is. Then I have to launch into a 10-minute explanation of what masculine and feminine are to explain that we're not talking about God. We're talking about interactions which do have gender. Okay, any questions on this? This is very important. Yeah, everyone good with this? So can anyone bring a logical explanation to me to explain why we believe God's outside of time? Maybe God's not outside of time. Maybe God's as affected by time as everybody else. What logic would you use? Infinite oneness means infinitely one. There's no right, left. There's no front, back. There's no up, down. There's no male, female. There's no tick, tock. Time is instances. It's all divisions. Infinite oneness has no divisions. If he wants a tick and a tock, if he wants instances, if he wants he has to will it into existence, just like gender. Okay, so diversity, non-oneness, is an artificial creation, and time is obviously whatever time is. It's not affecting God. Good. Okay, excellent. Very good. So now, just for fun, tell me what gender are the Jewish people? We said most of the time we're feminine relative to God, except for the Shekinah, which is a famous feminine name where we're masculine. What gender would you say we are relative to Shabbat? We're feminine, Shabbat's masculine? Correct. When you sing Lecha Dodi on Friday nights, you call her your bride. Welcome, O bride. Remember that? So the Kabbalist who wrote that is trying to hint that we're being masculine and giving over to Shabbat on Friday night. Now, really, it's a bit of a trick question because Shabbat has both genders in it. Did you know that? Did you know that everything about Shabbat is dual? Did you ever notice that? 2 challahs, 2 candles, 2. So there's a masculine aspect to Shabbat and there's a feminine aspect to Shabbat. But when Shabbat comes in, we're being masculine relative to her. So even though Shabbat has both masculine and feminine in it, the Friday night seems to be emphasizing us being masculine relative to her. Okay? So there's going to be other relationships during those 24 hours, but that would make sense, right? Because we're going to give over to Shabbat different than we give over to Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday, Friday. We're going to give over different clothing, different conversations, different meals, different attitude, different approach. We're going to create a certain Kedusha, giving over a different 24 hours than we would if it was Sunday night, Monday night. You follow? What's she going to do if she's our bride? Remember, what's feminine? Rules and limitations that take you to a higher level, right? So what's she going to do? She's going to limit herself down to only the Jewish people. Nobody else has Shabbat. And she's going to take us to a higher level. And we're going to come out of Shabbat on a higher level than we went in. That's the feminine partnership when we're masculine and give over to our bride. Okay? We'll continue with masculine and feminine letter Hey on Tuesday. We'll stop over here.